Well, welcome back, and we are going to just continue on. We're in 1 Samuel 21. We finished out 1 Samuel chapter 20. We saw David meeting Jonathan there secretly. Saul's out to get him, and one of the many times that seemed to happen in David's life. And so that kind of wraps up and a kind of a very tender scene between David and Jonathan. And now we see in chapter 21 that David is going to flee. Jonathan said, "Get out of here, my father means you harm." And so David takes his wise advice. And we'll start our reading in 1 Samuel chapter 21, and we'll read the first 10 verses or so of chapter 21. Then came David to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, "Why art thou alone, and no man with thee?" And David said unto Ahimelech the priest, "The king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, Let no man know anything of the business whereabout I sent thee, and what I have commanded thee. And I have appointed my servants to such and such place. Now therefore, what is under thine hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, or what there is present." And the priest answered David and said, "There is no common bread under mine hand, but there is hallowed bread, if the young men have kept themselves at least from women." And David answered the priest and said unto him, "Of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy. And the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel." So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord, to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg an Edomite, the chiefest of the herdmen that belonged to Saul. And David said unto Ahimelech, "And is there not here under thine hand spear or sword? For I have neither brought my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste." And the priest said, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom thou slewest in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If thou wilt take that, take it, for there is no other save that here." And David said, "There is none like that. Give it me." And David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul, and went to Achish, the king of Gath. So David is fleeing from Saul. David is given really, he's kind of out of options. And so he runs to Ahimelech the priest and says, "I need some food." The whole thing about the king's business, I think maybe he was afraid Ahimelech wouldn't side with him, perhaps. I'm not exactly sure how that whole thing went down. It appears that David kind of made up a story. He was not a perfect person. He sounds like he kind of lied to the priest to be able to get some sustenance. I haven't really studied that out in depth, so I want to be careful before I say something like that. But so he says, I need some bread, and he says, all I have is the showbread that's holy and dedicated unto the Lord. And David said, "Well, go ahead and give it to me." In fact, this is referenced later on. I believe Jesus talks about. I believe it was Jesus talks about how David ate of the showbread, and so this comes into play later on in the New Testament. But this is the story that is being referenced, that where David goes to the priest, and Doeg the Edomite is there that day and witnesses all that goes on, and we're going to find out some pretty awful things are about to happen here in David's life. So Ahimelech gives him the showbread, and Ahimelech, when David says, "Do you have any weapons?" "I left my weapons. I was in a hurry when I left, and I didn't bring any sword or weapons with me." Ahimelech says, "All I have is the sword of Goliath that you killed." And David said, "Oh yeah, I like that sword." And evidently he's big enough to use it now, and so he receives that gift from Ahimelech. And then leaves. Now, I think it's interesting that he goes to Achish, king of Gath. This is where Goliath is from, and it seems unusual, to say the least, in my mind. Why Gath? And I don't think it has to do with him running to the Philistines necessarily. I think he considered Achish a friend. And I'll talk more about that, about why I believe that later on. And I think Achish was in some way a friend to David, But something really kind of happens very odd in the next section, verses 11 to 15. We'll look at that in a second. But I want to say a word about Ahimelech. He was a man of God. He was the priest. And I think the man of God recognized the special circumstances and carried out unusual duties. This priest, I believe, knew God's will and took extreme measures in extreme times. You wouldn't ordinarily walk into the tabernacle or the temple and say to the priest, I need bread. I see all you have is the Lord's bread. I'll just take that. That's not how things normally went. And yet that's exactly what happens here. And David, he was surprised to see David. Why don't you have any men with you? And he asked him some questions. And there's an interview here that almost is like Ahimelech was kind of probing for a little more information. I think maybe that's what scared David a little bit into coming up with some kind of a cover story. But then he flees to Gath. And you think, wow, that's so strange. Let's continue reading verses 11 to 15. And we really won't answer this question in depth until another class. I don't remember if it's the next one or two out. But Achish does prove his loyalty to David ultimately. But as of right now, he's kind of waffling, at least as far as his public persona is concerned. So let's continue reading. 1 Samuel 21 verse 11 says, And the servants of Achish said unto him, Is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing one to another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? And David laid up these words in his heart, and was sore afraid of Achish the king of Gath. And he changed his behavior before them, and feigned himself mad in their hands, and scrabbled on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. Then said Achish unto his servants, Lo, ye see the man is mad. Wherefore then have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen, that ye have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? So something about the nature of the questions of the counselors of Achish tips David off that he's probably not in the safest position he's been in his whole life. And so he starts to act like he's a madman. He starts drooling and writing stupid stuff on the gates of the room they're in, and starts acting like a crazy person. The way the Bible says is it changed his behavior. And basically Achish says, You're not coming into my house. Now, this is where Psalm 34 comes in. And so we're going to turn over to Psalm 34. David finds himself in a very uncomfortable predicament. But I want you to note the heading in Psalm 34. If you look at it, it says a Psalm of David, when he changed his behavior before Abimelech, who drove him away and he departed. Here's what I believe on this. I sort of believe that Abimelech was probably Achish's chief counselor. And that's the best way I can describe that I can find. I did do a little bit of study in this. I couldn't find a lot of information on it specifically, but we have three men. They all start with A. We have Ahimelech, we have Abimelech, and we have Achish. Achish is the king. Ahimelech is the priest. And at first I thought maybe this was just an alternate spelling, Abimelech, of Ahimelech. But Ahimelech didn't drive him away. David didn't change his behavior before Ahimelech. So this is a different individual. Achish is not mentioned here in this prelude to the psalm. So the best I can figure is that the First Samuel doesn't tell him that Achish personally drove him away. There were others present. If we go back and look at it specifically, it says that David changed his behavior before them. The counselors were asking questions, so there were other people there. So I tend to think that maybe the leader of the charge in an attempt to get Achish to send David away was probably a man named Abimelech. So I can't prove that, and things in Scripture I try not to be dogmatic on, but that is one possible suggestion of how David was able, what David wrote here reconciles with 1 Samuel. So Achish himself didn't drive David away. He said, He's not coming into my house. And Abimelech, who probably offered those questions. Isn't this David that they sang about, that they danced about, that is going to be king of Israel, was named Abimelech. So that's probably the most likely conclusion that I can draw from this, is that Ahimelech is the priest, and so really he doesn't feature anymore right now in the story. He'll show up later. But Abimelech is probably a counselor to Achish, and Abimelech was the one who physically challenged him and changed Achish's mind, that caused the fear within David. And Abimelech is one who probably manhandles David and tosses him out. So that's the best that I can do as far as that goes. When the Bible is not highly specific, we cannot be highly specific. I suppose there could be another instance where another person named Abimelech, that David changed his behavior before, but we're not told that, and we are told that this happens here. So that's the best I can do there. Psalm 34, though, let's take a look at the psalm. It's a beautiful piece of work. Let's read verses 1 through 3. Psalm 34, 1 through 3. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall be continually in my mouth. My soul shall make her boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear thereof and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. This is an invitation for us to worship God with David. How cool is that? We can take David's lyrics here, and we can worship God together with His Majesty, King of Israel. And I think that is so very cool. But I want you to notice a pattern. In Hebrew poetry, really all Near Eastern poetry, they have, or Oriental styled poetries, they have something called parallelism. And I'm not going to get deep into it. I do in my hymnology class. I'm not going to get into it deeply here. But parallelism are comparisons and contrasts. In our language, we are very, very attuned to rhythm and rhyme. That really wasn't a concern for the Hebrew poets. The Hebrew poets and the Oriental poets compared about how eloquently they could compare or contrast something. And that's what was, to draw those parallels, and that's why we call it parallelism. In this, we see that King David and then all others do one thing and then the other. And you see the time and again, just in the 3 verses, David says, I'll bless the Lord, his praise shall be in my mouth, my soul will make her boast in the Lord. The humble, all others, shall hear the Lord and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, David says, and let us, everyone else, exalt his name together, he says. And as you go through this, you see this jumping back and forth between David and believers, David and believers, David and believers. So this invitation to worship God together is actually part of the lyric itself. So I think that's just really, really cool. So let's continue reading. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. Verse 3. Verse 4. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and he delivered me from all my fears. They looked unto him and were lightened, and their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him, and delivereth them. How awesome is that? What a comfort it is to know that the same God that rescued David out of all his troubles is the same God that also will rescue us out of our troubles. In fact, we're going to talk about the word rescue a little bit later on. But he's the same God who rescues us out of our troubles. This is the same God. And so we can, with David, worship God for how amazing he is at providing for us in those times of difficulty. This same God David cried to is the same God we can cry to. And we have that great comfort. Look at verse 8. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him. Oh, fear the Lord, ye saints of his, for there is no want to them that fear him. The young lions do lack and suffer hunger, but they that seek the Lord shall not want any good thing. I'll never forget as a child, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Why wouldn't I want him? That's how I used to interpret that as a child. That word want there means lack. You're not going to have want for anything. You will not lack anything. So when you go back and you read that, the young lions do lack and suffer hunger, they see the Lord shall not lack any good thing. And wow, fear God, and he's going to take care of you. Do what he asks, and he is going to take care of you. I can't think of any more positive message I can give to a scared and a tormented world than that message right there, that the Lord is good. And they that fear him shall not lack any good thing. Verse 11, come, ye children, hearken unto me, and I will teach you the fear of the Lord. What man is he that desireth life and loveth many days, that he may see good? Keep thy tongue from evil, and thy lips from speaking guile. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. And he's telling us how we can live in the fear of the Lord. Verse 15 says this, the eyes of the Lord the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open unto their cry. So again, we've moved generally from David, specifically to David, generally into everybody who fears the Lord. Verse 16, the face of the Lord is against them that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry, and the Lord heareth, and delivereth them out of all their troubles. Now, I want to say something. That deliverance may not be what we expect. That deliverance may not be in a way that we imagine in our own minds. But the promise stands. Those that fear the Lord and cry out to him will receive deliverance. Beautiful. So beautiful. Let me see. Where was I? Verse 17, the righteous cry and heareth, and the Lord delivereth them out of all their troubles. Verse 18, the Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them all. He keepeth all his bones, not one of them is broken. Evil shall slay the wicked, and they that hate the righteous shall be desolate. God longs to bless his children, which is why he asks for obedience. Obedience brings blessing. Those that fear God and walk in the fear of the Lord experience the blessing of God. Evil brings destruction, and the word in the psalm here is desolation to the wicked. Verse 22, the Lord redeemeth the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. Now, this is not a prosperity gospel. When I think of people like Corrie ten Boom, who was imprisoned by the Nazis and treated so horribly. Her sister died in a prison camp. Her father buried in a common grave, never found his body, and went through the tortures and the horrors and the humiliation of living in these awful, awful conditions and concentration camps. When I think of somebody like that, and I read verses like that, it doesn't line up in my mind. This is not a prosperity gospel. This isn't get saved, follow Jesus, and all your troubles go away. So we're talking about a different kind of rescue. We're talking about a different kind of deliverance. This isn't, I'm going to make sure you win every one of your struggles. This isn't, I'm going to make sure you have every penny that you absolutely need, although he does provide for our needs. This is something else. The word redeem here in verse 22, the Lord redeemed the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. That word redeem literally means to rescue. Do we trust in him or flee for refuge? We put our confidence in him. That word desolate means to acknowledge offense. We will be guilty of offending God. We will not be guilty, rather, of offending God by running to him in times of trouble. This puts me in mind of the great old hymn, How Firm a Foundation. We see in verse 1, the hymn writer asks a question. The whole thing's one big long question, and it's a little wordy, so I want to break it down a little bit. How firm a foundation, ye saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. Then he asks another question. What more can he say than to you he hath said? What more can he say to you who for refuge to Jesus have fled? Well, he's got a few verses of things that the Lord has said. And so in verse 2, he picks up and says, fear not, I'm with thee. Oh, be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will still give thee aid. I'll strengthen thee, help thee, and cause thee to stand, upheld by my righteous, or rather gracious, omnipotent, all-powerful hand. Verse 3, in every condition, in sickness, in health, in poverty's veil, or abounding in wealth, at home and abroad, on the land, on the sea, as thy days may demand, so thy strength ever be. When through the deep waters he calls thee to go, the rivers of grief shall not thee overflow, for he will be with thee in trouble to bless and sanctify to thee thy deepest distress. When through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace, all sufficient, shall be thy supply. The flames shall not hurt thee. I only design thy dross to consume, and thy gold to refine. And then the hymn writer in verse 6 gives us God's perspective. The soul that on Jesus hath leaned for repose, I will not desert to its foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no never forsake. Wow, what wonderful, wonderful words in that good old hymn, How Firm a Foundation. It takes us to the end of 1 Samuel chapter 21. So if we continue into chapter 22, that we see that David is once again pursued by Saul. Jonathan was right. They had met. David was afraid and convinced by Jonathan that his father meant him harm, and so David flees to the king, to King Achish in Gath, in the land of the Philistines, and so he hightails it out of there, and is right. Jonathan was right. David's senses were right. Saul is out to get him once again. So 1 Samuel chapter 22 then. 1 Samuel chapter 22, begin reading in verse 1. David therefore departed thence and escaped to the cave Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him, and every one that was in distress, and every one that was in debt, and every one that was discontented, gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. And David went thence to Mizpah of Moab, and he said unto the king of Moab, Let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be with you, till I know what God will do for me. And he brought them before the king of Moab. And they dwelt with him all the while that David was in the hold. And the prophet Gad said unto David, Abide not in the hold, depart, and get thee into the land of Judah. Then David departed and came into the forest of Hereth. Now, so what happens? David runs from the land of the Philistines, and because he was afraid, again, that he was running for his life. So Saul's out to get him. The Philistines don't appreciate that they killed their warrior and that he's so popular among the people. And so Achish says, you got to leave. And so he's cast out, again, I believe, by Abimelech, officially away from the king's presence. And so he runs and he hides in the cave Adullam. While there, his family finds out that he's there. And you got to imagine another tender scene happens here. His father and his mother and now a small army show up when they find out where David is at. God has given him favor among the people. And David does something. He's the youngest. And yet he takes responsibility as the head of the household and puts his parents and his family in protective custody. Now you think, Moab. Now, weren't they enemies of God too? Why Moab? Well, I think I have the connection there. If you go back and you read the book of Ruth, the very end of the book of Ruth, we find out that Ruth was a Moabitess. Some believe that she was actually part of the royal family of Moab. The Bible does not say that expressly as far as I know, but it would make sense then that's quite likely or even possible that David was entrusting his family to distant relations by taking them and putting them in the custody of the king of Moab. So that makes a little more sense than him running to Gath, as far as I'm concerned, because there was some family connection there. And so he puts his parents in protective custody of the king of Moab, and they lived in Mizpah. A prophet comes to David by the name of Gad, and that's all we ever know about him, that he's a prophet of the Lord. His name is Gad, and he has one message for David, and he walks off the pages of the Bible, and as far as I know, he never appears again. But he says, get out of here. You need to go to Judah. And so David does that. So he flees Adullam, the cave there, and he lives in the forest of Hereth in Judah. Verse 6 says, so the priest gave him, verse 6, when Saul heard that David was discovered and that the men were with them, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having a spear in his hand, and all the servants were standing about him. Then Saul said unto his servants that stood about him, Hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands, captains of hundreds, that all of you may have conspired against me? And there is none that showeth me that my son hath made a league with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you that is sorry for me, and showeth unto me that my son hath stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. So he kind of pitches a fit, kind of throws a little temper tantrum. None of you love me. You all, even my own son, conspired with the son of Jesse. You all knew it. Nobody told me. Kind of, I don't know. Read the Bible with a little imagination. I think he kind of, pitched a fit a little bit here. Well, his manipulation tactic kind of worked a little bit. Saul pleased with his servants for information regarding David. And now Doeg, remember? He was mentioned in the last chapter. Doeg the Edomite speaks up and turns in David. He betrays him to Saul. Look in we read verse 7 and 8. Verse 9, then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him victuals, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Then the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests that were in Nob, and they came, all of them, to the king. Now we're setting up something. Saul basically, Doeg turned Ahimelech the priest in and gave evidence or testimony that he had aided and abetted David and his men. Well, actually, just David specifically. And so Saul calls Ahimelech and his whole family to come in before him. So verse 14, verse 12, we have a kind of a trial like deal here. Verse 12, and Saul said, Hear now, thou son of Ahitub. And he answered, Here I am, my Lord. So Ahimelech treats Saul with respect. Now it could be out of fear, or perhaps Saul just actually feared God enough to fear his king. Verse 13, and Saul said unto him, Why have ye conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, in that thou hast given him bread and a sword, and hast inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me, to lie in wait, as at this day? Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, And who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding, and is honorable in thine house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father, for thy servant knew nothing of this, less or more. Now remember, David said, I came on an errand for the king. So he's probably speaking the truth. Although I think Ahimelech's senses were tingling, maybe, that something more was going on, and that's why he started probing for questions. But when he came to give account of his actions before Saul, he said, as far as I know, David's a faithful servant of you. He comes and goes when you tell him to come and when you tell him to go, and he does what you ask him to do. Who is more faithful than your servant David? The king's son, your son-in-law, your own family. Well, Saul will have none of his excuses, and just a really, really horrible thing happens here. Saul's mental distress, his mental anguish just overpowers his senses of judgment, even his fear of the Lord on multiple occasions. And this is certainly one of them. Look in verse 16. And the king said, Thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house. And the king said unto the footmen that stood about him, Turn and slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand also was with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not show it to me. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. Well, thank God somebody had the guts to stand up for righteousness. And you start to think that, okay, well, so Ahimelech's going to be all right. Well, we got to keep reading, unfortunately. Verse 18, the king said unto Doeg, Turn thou and fall upon the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned, he fell upon the priests, and slew on that day 85 persons that did wear a linen ephod. He killed 85 priests. And Nob, the city of priests, smote he with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and sucklings, and oxen and asses and sheep with the edge of the sword. And one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar showed David that Saul had slain the Lord's priests. And David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul. I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. Abide thou with me, fear not, for he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life, but with me thou shalt be in safeguard. David takes responsibility for his actions, and he looks at Abiathar and he says, I'm responsible. When I saw Doeg the Edomite there, something inside me told me that rat was going to tell Saul. And I'm the reason that your family is dead. Now, the same man who wants you dead wants me dead. Stick with me, and I'll do my best to keep you safe. And so he offers protection to Abiathar, the only remaining member of Ahimelech's family. What a sad story. Oh, don't worry, we're not done with Doeg the Edomite. All right, we're not done with him yet. This is an awful, awful man. He kills 85 priests. He decimates the city of Nob, which is an entire city of priests. He killed everything that breathed, men, women, children, and animals. When David learns of Doeg's atrocities, God allows Abiathar, who was his son, to escape. He told everything to David, and David confesses he suspected what would go on. It's at this point that David pens Psalm 52. So we're going to take a look at Psalm 52. Let me go there. Psalm 52. All right, we have another heading here. To the chief musician, Mashil. Remember, that's a teaching psalm. Mashil. All right, this is a psalm of David, and again, it was written for the specific event when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said unto him, David is come to the house of Ahimelech. So this is highly specific. This is exactly this instance. David finds out, takes Abiathar into his company of men and offers him his protection. And this is what David has to say. Why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. Thy tongue deviseth mischiefs, like a sharp razor working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. Selah. David describes the tongue of the wicked man, and obviously he's speaking specifically to Doeg, so much so that he wrote it right in the title of the song. This is when Doeg went and tattletaled. This is the words of a wicked man. These are the qualities of a wicked tongue. Boast of their own mischief. They work deceitfully. They love evil, and they love lying. Think about that. Selah. Verse 4. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place and root thee out of the land of the living. Selah. The righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. This is prophetic. Doeg is going to get his comeuppance. We don't have that yet. David doesn't know this is going to happen, but it is going to happen. David trusts God to be the master balancer of situations. God will fine-tune the events in our lives. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Vengeance belongeth unto God. And when we leave vengeance up to God, when we leave vengeance up to God's timing, it always works out perfectly. When we take matters into our own hands, we mess it up royally. We mess it up because we can't see the end from the beginning. We don't know what is truly just in our own finite understanding, but God does, and He will so ordain the events that retributive justice will always be perfectly exacted as it should be, even though we may not agree with it. So David lets the Lord handle it. Now let's continue reading. 2 more verses. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise thee forever because thou hast done it. And I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. Whoa. So David puts his trust in God. David says that he is going to thank God and praise God already. Why? For 2 reasons. One, because he is flourishing like a green olive tree. He is live and healthy. And because he trusts that God will do it. Awesome. You know, we don't always know when the rough times in our lives are going to end, but we can tell when God is working in our life. We can flourish in adversity. We can flourish in fear. We can flourish through trials if our trust is in the Lord. We need to go back to 1 Samuel. Back in 1 Samuel, chapter 22, and we're going to pick up in chapter 23. 1 Samuel 23 then. So David writes this psalm after all this goes down, and so now he goes over to Keilah is the name of the city. They told David, verse 1, saying, "Behold, the Philistines fight against Keilah, and they rob the threshing floors." So David finds out something's going on, and he's going to head over and he's going to do something about it. So now he's going to do Saul's job. Instead of running around chasing David, Saul should be protecting the nation, and he's not. So David finds out something's going on, there's some mischief afoot, and he's going to investigate and take care of the issue, like Saul's supposed to be doing. But Saul's too busy carrying out personal vengeance. Verse 2. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go and smite these Philistines?" And the Lord said unto David, "Go and smite the Philistines and save Keilah." So he gets a direct orders from God himself. It's something God places on his heart to go take care of this situation. And David says, I'm going to confirm my own heart, right? Our heart is deceitful above all things, desperately wicked. Who can know it? Certainly not even ourselves. And so David takes the burden of his heart to God, and God confirms the burden. That's the way we need to do things, by the way. When God lays something on our heart, we need to go to God and get that confirmation from God himself that this burden is genuine and we ought to do something about it, or we can find ourselves rushing into things that are not in his will truly. Because our heart will deceive us. So David does this. He follows those steps. He takes his burden to God, and God says, "Go." So remember, he had gathered about 400 men in the cave of Adullam, and evidently they just move around with him. So there's David and his militia, as it were, running around the hillsides between Philistia and Judah, and he's just kind of doing his thing. But verse 4 kind of gives me a Robin Hood kind of a sense. You know, when I read some of these stories, he's going in and he's kind of taking care of some things, or Swamp Fox, the military guerrilla warfare that was practiced by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Marion during the American Revolutionary War. They weren't the regulars. They were fields and farmers with pitchforks and rifles, and they would shoot from hedges and rocks and fences. And they did so much to break the supply lines of the British and just shake up the most powerful army and navy of the world. And I kind of get this from David. He's kind of going to do some guerrilla warfare here. And so he goes over to Keilah. Verse 3, David's men said unto him, "Behold, we be afraid here in Judah. How much more if we come to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?" Then David inquired of the Lord yet again. And the Lord answered him and said, "Arise, go to Keilah, for I will deliver the Philistines in thy hand." So God says, yes, go ahead and take care of the problem over in Keilah. And the men come to David and they said, "Okay, well, I know God told you to go to Keilah, but we're kind of afraid." This is the army of the Philistines, and we're not. Why don't you ask God one more time? So David does. David honors his men who are under him, and you're going to find this quality of David a lot. David does show great respect for others for their service to him. He honors people. We'll see this happen more and more. David's a very humble person, I believe, in real life, and we see this in the accounts of the scriptures. And so David takes this particular question back to God, and God says, "I'm going to give you the victory. Go to Keilah. Go." All right? So he reconfirms what David wanted to do. He reconfirms that all the fears of the men are going to come to naught, and promises him victory in battle. So he takes his men, and verse 5, so David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their cattle and smote them with a great slaughter. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. And it came to pass, when Abiathar the son of Ahimelech fled to David to Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. Now we're kind of setting up kind of another story, but his men kind of get fear. God assures David the victory, so we get Abiathar kind of enters the story again. He ended up bringing an ephod with him, And this is significant. The ephod was the breastplate that the priests used to wear. It was a holy garment. It was a sanctified garment. Look in verse, I believe that was 7, verse 7, yes. And it was told Saul that David was come to Keilah, and Saul said, God hath delivered him into mine hand, for he is shut in by entering into a town that hath gates and bars. And Saul called all the people together to war, to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. So Keilah's a walled city. David's inside there spoiling the things of the Philistines when they were, after he had slaughtered them, he was beginning to take their stuff. Hey, it's the rights of war. The conqueror has rights to what he has conquered. And so Saul hears and finds out there's some disturbance over in Keilah. Are you kidding? David is inside a walled city. Here's my way. God has delivered him into my hand. This man's messed up. I mean, he is totally messed up. I mean, he's totally not on the same wavelength of God as God at all. He's a mess. God has delivered him into my hand. You know good and well he's meant to be the next king of Israel. That's what made you go berserk about him in the first place. Jonathan knows he's to be the next king of Israel. We're going to see that here in just a couple of minutes. Well, I don't remember if it's in this class or the next one, but we're going to see that Saul and Jonathan both recognize David is going to be the next king of Israel. God has delivered him into my hands. Are you kidding me? You mean God wants you to, what, is he going to raise him back up from the dead to make him king of Israel? This man's mental state is just so cattywampus that it just doesn't make any sense to me. But verse, let me see, where were we? We were in verse 8, verse 9. It says, and David knew that Saul secretly practiced mischief against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, bring hither the ephod. Then said David, O Lord God of Israel, thy servant hath certainly heard that Saul seeketh to come to Keilah, to destroy the city for my sake. Will the men of Keilah deliver me up into his hand? Will Saul come down as thy servant hath heard? O Lord God of Israel, I beseech thee, tell thy servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Then said David, will the men of Keilah deliver me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will deliver thee up. Well, that's a fine thank you. We just saved all your lives. We saved all your possessions. And you're going to turn me into my enemy? And God says, yes, this is exactly what's going to happen. And I love this, that in times of questioning, in times of distress, in times of fear, David just doesn't react. He goes to God. And what a lesson that needs to be in our own lives. We need to go to God in these times when we are scared, when we are afraid, when we are uncertain, when we don't know which path to choose. We go to God. He'll answer us. He'll give us direction. He'll give us guidance. Verse 13, then David and his men were about 600, so his army has grown, and departed out of Keilah and went whithersoever they could go. And it was told Saul that David was escaped from Keilah, and he forbore to go forth. So David's army is now 600 people, and they kind of disband. They get out of Keilah. Saul was notified of David's departure. He doesn't even bother pursuing him any further once he knows that he doesn't have him hemmed in. So in verse 14, David flees again. 14 and 15. And David abode in the wilderness in strongholds and remained in the mountains of the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God delivered him not into his hand. And David saw that Saul was come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a wood. So he hides in the woods in the wilderness, and he pens Psalm 63. So we need to go to Psalm 63. While he's hiding from Saul, and he's kind of on the run, they're hiding from Saul. Saul is just absolutely hampering David, pursuing him daily, it says. Instead of running his country and saving him from skirmishes with the Philistines and doing, the things that the king is supposed to do, he's out on his personal vendetta. Politics hasn't changed a whole lot, I suppose. But Psalm 63, a Psalm of David, when he's in the wilderness of Judah. So this is when David wrote Psalm 63. And this is what it says. O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee. My flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see thy power and thy glory, so as I have seen thee in the sanctuary. Because thy loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise thee. Thus will I bless thee while I live. I will lift up my hands in thy name. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise you with joyful lips when I remember thee upon my bed and meditate on thee in the night watches, because thou hast been my help. Therefore in the shadow of thy wings shall I rejoice. My soul followeth hard after thee. Thy right hand upholdeth me. But those that seek my soul to destroy it shall go into the lower parts of the earth. They shall fall by the sword. They shall be a portion for foxes. But the king shall rejoice in God. He's talking about himself. He in his mind is already enthroned. But the king shall rejoice in God. Every one that sweareth by him shall glory. But the mouth of them that speak lies shall be stopped. We thinking still about Doeg the Edomite maybe a little bit, possibly? Perhaps. Or maybe the fact that Saul's boasting that he's, God has delivered him into my hand. He calls himself the king. And I think that's very telling when you really put it in the context of the story. David has not yet been crowned king of Judah or Israel, and yet he says the king is going to praise God anyway, even in this difficult time. So we go back to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, and remember, he fled from where he was at there at Keilah because he was afraid that he was going to be turned in, and God said, yeah, they're going to turn you in. That's why he's in the wilderness to begin with. And so Jonathan comes to visit David there in the wilderness. Verse 16, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong chapter. 1 Samuel 23, verse 16, and Jonathan's son Saul arose, went to David into the wood, and strengthened his hand in God. And he said unto him, fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee, and thou shalt be king over Israel, and I shall be next unto thee, and that also Saul my father knoweth. Saul knew. Jonathan knew. God's plan. God, it's delivered you into my hand. All right? And that's where our sin takes us, by the way. Our sin makes us that imbalanced. Our sin makes us that ridiculous looking. He just looked ridiculous. Verse 18, he says this, and they two made a covenant before the Lord, and David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went into his house. This is the last time David sees Jonathan alive, at least as that is recorded for us. This is their parting. Jonathan visits David, assures him God's promises. What friendship? You have friends that do that for you? Those times of difficulty, they don't come to you and give you the latest Oprah quote. They give you God's word, the truths of God's word. That's what Jonathan did with David here. My father's not going to find you. God intends you to be king, and I know that. I'll be next to you. He abdicates his position as crown prince of Israel. Jonathan doesn't know he's going to die. When my father dies, you're king. Jonathan knew this. He declares David's succession to the throne after his father dies. But again, remember, he flees Keilah because he's afraid of being turned in. Look at verse 19. Then came the Ziphites to Saul. Are you kidding me? To Gibeah, saying, doth not David hide himself with us in strongholds in the wood in the hill of Hachilah, which is on the south of Jeshimon? Now therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of thy soul to come down, and our part shall be to deliver him into the king's hand. This guy can't win. David has nowhere to go. People seem to have turned against him for whatever reason. Maybe they were afraid of Saul. Perhaps this particular segment of the population didn't care for David. Whatever the reason, in spite of the fact that even Jonathan himself, who should be on the throne next, humanly speaking, it recognizes David's succession to the throne. These people are willing to turn David in. It's unbelievable to me. Verse 21, and David said, blessed be ye of the Lord, for ye have compassion on me. It's all about him, isn't it? Verse 22, go, I pray you, prepare yet and know, and see this place where his haunt is, and who hath seen him there, for it is told me that he dealeth very subtly. See therefore, and take knowledge of all the lurking places where he hideth himself. And come ye again to me with the certainty, and I will go with you. And it shall come to pass, if he be in the land, that I will search him out thoroughly, that I will search him throughout all the thousands of Judah. Unbelievable. So the Ziphites betray Saul. And now David writes Psalm 54. Psalm 54. So we need to turn there. It's at this point where David flees being turned into Saul out of the frying pan into the fire of being betrayed to Saul. So he writes this to the chief, Psalm 54, to the chief musician on Neginoth, Mashil, a psalm of David, when the Ziphims came and said to Saul, doth not David hide himself with us? Now, a couple of things. All right, the heading here is to the chief musician. At this time in David's life, that would have been Asaph. I don't remember if we're going to get into his life or not. You want to actually study a kind of a unsung hero of the Bible, you need to study the life of Asaph. He's really an incredible person. Then it says on Neginoth. On Neginoth means that it's played on stringed instruments. So David is giving some performance instructions on how the psalm would be performed. Then Mashil's a teaching psalm, and it's a psalm of David written for this specific event. This is what David says when he gets turned in, when he flees from the frying pan and finds himself in the fire. He says, "Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them. Selah. Behold, God is mine helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. He shall reward evil unto mine enemies. Cut them off in thy truth. I will freely sacrifice unto thee. I will praise thy name, O Lord, for it is good. For he hath delivered me out of all my trouble, and mine eye hath seen his desire upon mine enemies." Has this happened yet? No. So once again, David expresses confidence in the protection and the providence and the provision of God. What a beautiful expression. A beautiful, beautiful expression of confidence in God. So we go back to 1 Samuel. David, again, is out of the frying pan and into the fire. So in 1 Samuel chapter 23, we'll pick up our reading in verse 24. What's David going to do? Where's he going to turn? It seems like everybody's turning him in. "And they arose and went to Ziph before Saul, but David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon in the plain on the south of Jeshimon. Saul also and his men went to seek him, and they told David, wherefore he came down into a rock and abode in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon." So he flees to Maon. When David found out that the men of Ziph went and told on him to Saul, he fled to Maon. Saul found out he was in Maon, pursues him there. Verse 26, "And Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain." I mean, he's getting close. "And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul, for Saul and his men compassed David and his men round about to take them." Now he's surrounded. Saul has caught up to him. Saul has surrounded him. Now what's going to happen? All right, verse 27, "But there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, Haste thee and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David, and did his job for once, and went against the Philistines. Therefore they called the place Selah Amalekath." And I did not look that up, so it's probably something like "save us and rescue us." But Selah Amalekath. "And David went up from thence and dwelt in the strongholds at En-gedi." And from there, we'll pick up next time on what happens once he reaches En-gedi. Some things happen there as well. Some more psalms are written. He takes a wife, actually, too. We'll talk about that later. And so we start kind of a new chapter in David's life. As Saul is too busy actually running the country, doing some warfare, to be chasing after David. So that's where we'll wrap up our reading at the end of 1 Samuel 23. God rescues David literally out of. Saul had him surrounded, and he had to leave. God rescues David out of his troubles. David said, "This place is too hot to hold me. I got to get out of here too." And he takes off to En-gedi. So that's where we'll leave off here at the end of 1 Samuel 23.